Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 8 audio lecture for English 1010. Today, I want to introduce Essay 4 by reading the prompt, offering some thoughts and commentary, potentially addressing any questions you might have, and then I want to take just a minute and discuss the reading I asked you to complete for this week. So let's start with the prompt itself, and this is the Essay 4 prompt, Combining Patterns. You'll find the module in the Content tab, and the prompt should be the first thing you see. So, okay, I'll read the prompt and follow along with me, and then, again, I'll offer some thoughts, commentary, etc. For this assignment, you will draft an essay incorporating several development patterns. Thus far this semester, we have used a set of specific patterns: narration, description, definition, and comparison and contrast. There are other patterns, however, that we have used implicitly, which is to say used without knowing it, such as exemplification, using examples, and cause and effect, why something happens or what might happen if something happens. As you can see, even though we have not worked with several of these patterns directly, they are patterns you know rather well. And I want to stop there for a second and say a little more about these different patterns, what patterns are available to you, etc. So and I'll get to this in just a minute. I asked you to, or I am asking you to complete reading out of a patterns PDF textbook that I have posted in the course documents tab. And one of the reasons why I've done this is because if you look at the table of contents for this patterns PDF, you'll notice that there are sections that are identified by a particular pattern of development. And so if you have questions, for example, about any pattern of development that you can use that we have not explicitly used, I want you to go to that patterns PDF, go to the table of contents, and just look at those different chapters. So you'll see chapters, for example, like exemplification, cause and effect, process. All of those are new patterns, which is to say patterns we have not used that are at your disposal that I think you can use and should use to some degree. And I'll talk about the particular rules and regulations, how many patterns I want you to use, how many new patterns I want you to use in just a moment. But I want to at least emphasize this language that's in the prompt where I say, you have used some of these patterns implicitly, which is to say you've perhaps used them without acknowledging them, or you've used them maybe without realizing it. And that's part of what I think, because again, I will ask you to adhere to a lot of rules for this essay in ways that I haven't in the past, but I don't want you to think that that a lot of what I'm asking you to do is not something that I have not asked you to do to this point, or what I'm asking you to do, you have not done to this point, because a lot of you, whether you realized it or not, you have used, for example, exemplification. If at any point in any of the essays that you've written this semester, you have started a sentence or a section with the following language, for example, you have used exemplification as a pattern. If, for example, you have described how to do something, you have used process as a pattern. So the point that I want to emphasize here quickly in summation is you've used these patterns before. You simply didn't know it. All I really want you to do for this essay, as far as the combining patterns is concerned, is to know what you are doing, to have a kind of awareness of the patterns you deploy, why you deploy them, when you deploy them, etc. Okay, let's return to the prompt. For this essay, you will pick your topic, but I want you to begin with a question. For example, let us assume I want to write an essay about the cost of daycare. Before offering a position, which is to say a thesis statement, I begin with the following question. Is child daycare too expensive? As always, pick a topic you care about. Also, pick a topic you know, because I do not want to see too much, if any, research for this assignment. As you know, that is for the next assignment, or as you should know, that is for the next assignment. So, okay, I'll pause here again and say something about this particular paragraph. Again, like so many of the essays I've asked you to write, you are selecting your topic. And when I say I want you to start with a question, I do not, and this is important, so please listen to me when I say this, I do not mean, this is not to suggest that I want you to, that it's a requirement for you to actively incorporate a question into your essay. When I say I want you to start with a question, what I mean is whatever your process looks like as you brainstorm, as you move to select a topic, and maybe some of you already do this, I want you to think about the questions you're asking. Because whatever questions you ask, that in many ways dictates and determines the direction your essay will go. And I'll talk about this more throughout this essay. I'll say more about this in the research essay unit. If you are still struggling to conceptualize what a thesis statement is, one way to do that is to imagine that it is an answer to the questions you ask, or it is an answer to the question you ask, because you could ask a single question, or perhaps for some essays, you are asking multiple questions. But I want you to think seriously. The point of this, when I say start with a question, what I really want you to do is to think seriously about the questions that are guiding your essay. And again, that is not to suggest, just to repeat myself, that is not to suggest that you must, that it is a requirement for this assignment, that you incorporate those questions or that question into your essay. I think there are effective ways of doing that, but I don't want you to think it's a requirement, and I don't want you to think that you must start your essay with a question. When I say start with a question, I am thinking more about brainstorming. I am thinking more about whatever your process looks like as you choose a topic, and in particular, as you choose a direction for your topic. Because even if you think about, for example, the particular topic in question that I ask as an example in the prompt, thinking about cost, that is not the only reason why, or that is not the only question one might ask when selecting child daycare options. So hopefully that illustration on the prompt shows you that the question you ask really creates a path or a direction for your essay. So the final paragraph on the prompt. Throughout this essay, you must identify the specific patterns you use. There is an example in the book in the Combining Patterns chapter, but we will discuss this, or we will discuss how to do this. We will discuss it this week. Also, this essay is much shorter than your previous essays. Not only is the minimum word count shorter, but I am also instituting a maximum word count because I want to see if you can perform with these sorts of constraints. Finally, you must use no fewer than 4 patterns in this essay, and one must be a pattern we have not used explicitly thus far this semester. So I'll pause here again and unpack this paragraph. When I say you must identify your patterns, I will post a video to Yuja explaining how you can do this. So I'll save that for later. And when I say you must use at minimum 4 patterns, obviously you can use more than that. And when I say that one must be a new pattern, I simply mean of the patterns we've used thus far, you can obviously use some of those because it would be hard not to, but I want to see you use at least one new pattern. And again, go to the Patterns PDF textbook because all of the information you need regarding patterns of development, you can find all of it there. And if you want, just hypothetically speaking, you could use more than one new pattern. If, for example, you want to use narration and compare and contrast and exemplification and finally process, that would satisfy this assignment, at least that aspect of the assignment. If you wanted to use compare and contrast, definition, and narration, and finally as a new pattern, process, that would satisfy this assignment. And finally, you'll notice, much like all of the essays I've asked you to write thus far, you have a minimum word count, but yeah, I am instituting a maximum word count as well. And this is because one of my goals for you for this assignment is to see if you can write under particular constraints. And the goal here is to ask you to think critically about how you develop ideas, the language you use, and perhaps even to put you in a position where you are implementing some rather aggressive editing strategies, because good editors, and this is something that I think is important, I say this often, good writers are good editors. At times, to be a good editor, that means you know, or you can identify moments where you need to expand upon an idea, but equally, or perhaps even more so, good editors know when to pull back. Good editors know when perhaps a writer has overdeveloped a point, or maybe even belabored a point to the point that it becomes distracting, reductive, etc. So that's something else that I really want you to do with this assignment. And for some of you, this will be harder than others. For those of you who have enjoyed the freedom to just write maybe 1,300 word essays, I'm asking more from you here, because I'm asking you to show restraint in ways that I have not thus far this semester. And finally, as you can see, there is this word range, right? So the minimum is 700, the maximum is 800. Try to fall within that range. And like everything else, adhere to the MLA documentation standards outlined on the syllabus. They are the same standards that we have used for everything else throughout this course to this point. Okay, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. But again, take some time, become familiar with the Patterns PDF textbook that's in the Course Documents tab, or in the Course Documents module in the Content tab, because it has a lot of useful information. In particular, if you need, and some of you might need this, which is totally understandable, just to be clear, if you need additional information, clarification about different patterns of development, the chapters devoted to those patterns, they are great resources for this. They provide reading material that functions as examples. They provide student essay examples, several pages of description. It's all incredibly helpful. So take a moment, become familiar with the Patterns PDF textbook, and of course, again, email me if you have any questions. So, okay, at this point, I want to transition to the reading for this week. I'll say a little bit about it. And of course, the reading, this is in the announcements feed, but for those of you who may have been confused, the reading for this week, it's in the Patterns PDF textbook. So that's where you'll find it. So what I asked you to read for this week is On Dumpster Diving by Lars Eitner, and the title of the piece is interesting. So this is an excerpt from a larger book, but the use of the preposition in the title, again, I think it's super interesting because I think it gives us a sense of, again, how Eitner wants to think about dumpster diving as a practice. He at times declares that he prefers the word scavenger instead of diver or dumpster diver. But I think what's really interesting, because I encouraged you to, when thinking about your own essays, start with a question, or imagine that you are starting with a question. I think you could argue that Eitner does something similar, and I'll leave it to you to decide what question or set of questions he wants to explore with this essay. But I think an important one gravitates around maybe some preconceptions, as he understands it, that people have about those who would dumpster dive, which perhaps is a short way, or another way of saying those who are homeless, those who are dispossessed, those who don't have the same kinds of privileges that most people do. And as you can see with his thesis statement, and this is on page 665, he says, I have learned much as a scavenger. And again, I think even this is what I find so fascinating about this essay, and I'll talk about it more. The idea that scavenging, diving for, or diving dumpsters, dumpster diving, the idea that it's potentially something that's instructive, that it could teach you something, that it could be a source of learning and information. I think Eitner's making an interesting calculation, which is most of us would perhaps instinctually disagree with this, or which is to say, a priori, without having any experience, we might hear something like this and think, well, no, that can't possibly be true. And this is one of the first things that I want to bring to your attention, why I think this particular piece is so interesting. Eitner, he's exploring a topic that most people might think is settled, or he's grappling with an idea that in many ways cuts against what most people would think is true, correct, etc. And I think I think there's a lot of ways of finding the source of an interesting topic. And this is certainly one way of doing it. I think chasing contradictions is really interesting, but knowing and having a sense of what most people think, and then seeing if perhaps there's something to think about and explore that runs in contradiction to, or runs counter to what people think. I think that's really the animating principle for this essay. And it's really quite interesting. And I would certainly ask you, do you think Eitner's right? Did this essay persuade you that, as he suggests throughout, that dumpster diving, being a scavenger, it's a kind of art form. It's a practice with a lot of diverse and complicated contours to it. It's not as simple as it might seem. And I think that's another interesting thing that Eitner really explores in this essay, how we have, perhaps principally based on optics and appearances, a certain idea of what it means to be a scavenger, what it means to be a dumpster diver, and Eitner certainly wants to disabuse us of those oversimplified mischaracterizations. But something else that I like that Eitner does throughout this essay, he's quite clear that this is not some idealistic life that's perfect, and I think in that way, if that was what he suggested, this essay would almost feel like something of an infomercial, right? I really like and appreciate the times when he's incredibly clear about the challenges of living a life like this. He mentions, for example, that there is not a month when he was, because even though this is in the present tense, this is not Eitner's current life, there was not a month when he wasn't sick, despite all of the precautionary measures that he put in place. It didn't always work. I think that is extremely fascinating. And I think all of that simply does the work of suggesting that this is not an idealistic life, that this is still very much a life defined by precarity. And he even, if you recall this point when he says, soft drinks or certain beverages that have really strong saccharine flavors, one, if one is so inclined as to try this life either by choice or in almost every other case necessity, be extremely skeptical of those kinds of beverages because they probably have alcohol in them. And the last thing you want is to be drunk or inebriated in public. I think all of these moments are really quite nice because it's not Eitner placing a kind of utopian rhetorical sheen on this life. In many ways, this is a deeply realistic essay, and I think those moments when he acknowledges the limitations of this life are moments that we should pay attention to because they remind us that Eitner's not trying to trick us into thinking there's something utopian about this. It is a hard life. Yes, as Eitner understands it, there are things someone can do. There's a process to put in place. And I think in many ways, this if we wanted to identify a primary pattern or a kind of guiding pattern, I think process is certainly one of those. Do not labor, as Eitner suggests, under some delusion that this is an easy life or a utopian life, so on and so forth. Other moments that I think are quite interesting, Eitner's clearly interested in offering a kind of class critique, and this is where he ends the reading that I asked you to do, and I'll come to that in just a moment, but I think one of the more interesting parts or sections is when he writes about some locations that are great locations for someone who wants to be a scavenger or someone who wants to dumpster dive. And one of those locations is the college campus or college campuses, in particular immediately after moments of elongated breaks, right? Perhaps right before or right after the holiday break, the Christmas break begins after the fall semester. And I think Eitner's point is really interesting. And it's simply this, that, college students are inclined to throw away things because they have the privilege to do that. And it's in that way an essay that's also interested in exploring and interrogating consumption habits, right? If you have, and I think for someone like Eitner, what he wants to ultimately suggest is a lot of this happens in a way that's not conscious, right? We are not actively making these decisions. And that's, I think, for Eitner, how a lot of really pernicious or negative consumption habits develop. It's really through a lack of care and awareness. And for someone like Eitner, he connects this directly to social and economic prosperity, right? If you have wealth and security, then throwing away food is not necessarily a big deal for you, right? Because you know there's more, as he says. I think this is a direct quote. There's more where that came from, right? And I think in particular when thinking about college students, and I think this is also super interesting, he's clearly thinking about a particular sort of college student, right? Is he thinking about, for example, community college students? Well, probably not, because most community colleges, an overwhelming majority of community colleges, do not house students on campus, right? Northeast State Community College, for example, like most colleges, like most community colleges, is a commuter college. And of course, there are four-year institutions that are like that as well, primarily, right? Even though many four-year institutions, if not all of them to some degree, house students on a campus of some kind. But I think his point ultimately is, if you are in a position of a kind of economic privilege, then your consumption habits and the sorts of assumptions you make, because this is very much an essay about assumptions, they are fundamentally different from other people, maybe people who live and exist in social and economic environments that are more precarious. And if you go, for example, to the end of this essay, this is one of the more interesting and I think rhetorically persuasive moments of the essay, when he perhaps counterintuitively links people who are extremely wealthy to people who live in perhaps the worst kind of poverty imaginable. And just even saying that, right? You might hear that and think, well, that couldn't possibly be true, right? How could, for example, the middle class be the most precarious? But for someone like Eitner, his point ultimately is, because of how, as he sees it, consumption habits in the United States work, those at the very bottom, the sorts of people who would almost always by necessity need to find their sources of survival in dumpsters, they know, they can rest assured that there's, quote, more where that came from, in the same way that the incredibly and extremely wealthy do. And, you know, I think there are ways of perhaps challenging this. Is this a woeful oversimplification? Sure, to some degree. I think it absolutely is. But I think his point, and this is a point worth really thinking through and attempting to unpack, I think his point ultimately is, it's the illusion of security that, as he sees it, the middle class has, that is most troubling. There's no illusion of security for someone like him as he exists in this essay. But again, because of how consumption habits work in the United States, he does have a kind of security. Now, it's a counterintuitive kind of security, but as he argues throughout this essay, it is a kind of security nonetheless. It's those who exist in the middle class who, as he sees it, not only have something to lose, but do not have the means to replace, more often than not, what they lose. They're the ones who are the most precarious. And I think, for example, when we think through, like, how many of you, for example, if you lost or destroyed your smartphone could just go and replace it tomorrow. I think for a lot of us, and I include myself in this, right? That would be rather, frustrating and upsetting cost. And I think that is precisely Eitner's point. And so again, just to perhaps reiterate, I think for Eitner, the idea is he really wants to explore, because this is an essay that's very much about economics. It's about socioeconomics. He really wants to explore this question of security and what it means to ultimately be secure. And I think he arrives at a rather provocative, he arrives at a rather provocative idea that is challenging to us. But I would love to know what you think about it as well. As I'm looking through the essay itself, as you can see, Eitner, he's quite good at using different types of patterns without necessarily announcing that he's doing so. And what I also think is interesting, and I think this is extremely instructive for all of you, a pattern of development, using and deploying a pattern of development that could mean several paragraphs, or it could just mean a couple of sentences, right? So if you are envisioning what your essay might look like, don't think that to successfully use a pattern of development, it needs to be several paragraphs. It could just be a couple of sentences. Now, it could also be several paragraphs, but it could also just be a couple of sentences. But also, I think, especially regarding your essays, this essay is quite good at illustrating how you need to have perhaps a primary or a principal pattern of development, and then all of these secondary and tertiary patterns of development that really work as supplements to that larger pattern of development. And what that might be for you in your essay, I think in many ways it's dictated and determined by your topic, and perhaps more importantly, your approach or your particular focus on or regarding that topic. So, okay, I think that's all I want to say. Please return to this essay, or this piece maybe is a better way to describe it, as an illustration, because I think Eitner does a lot of wonderful, wonderful things here. I didn't really talk about this, but I think he uses narration and narrative as a pattern quite effectively. But this is a wonderful illustration of how to deploy multiple patterns of development in a single piece. But again, please remember, as I said earlier, this is something all of you have done, whether you knew it or not. All I'm asking you to do is have a kind of awareness about what you are doing. Okay, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you for your time and attention. This is Colin Cox for English 1010. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.